Hello everyone, today we're going to be covering how to create a React Chrome extension. We're going to be using Ruby on Rails as a backend API for this and React Query to make sure that we load our data appropriately, which will help us avoid race conditions, and it'll also help us with our Chrome extension itself. So this is a Chrome extension we'll be building. It's a to-do list with the name of the to-do as well as a checkbox. Now we're not doing like a form or anything here. I'm just covering getting and updating these. You could of course use a regular React form and it'll work just fine with an API request all the same. In this case, I just covered these two because I thought it's the easiest way to showcase how this works from both the reading and the writing perspective. Now, if we check this box down here, we'll see that we have a update sent to our backend where we just tell it, hey, can you update this to do? And this box is no longer checked. If I now click out of here or I go over to here and I open this up in a tab that I haven't refreshed, you'll see that it's just the same. I can refresh this tab and come over here, it's still working. So that's good. The other thing we can do is we can come over into our API. We have these two items, right? That will match this data right here. The first one is set to false. The second one is set to true. But if I open up our Chrome extension and, well, actually, let me refresh. I'll stop this server. You'll see the server is down. And now if I click on this, the Chrome extension will just say that it's loading. It won't change at all. It'll sit here and say it's loading, which is true. It's trying to communicate with the backend, but the backend's not up. But if I go ahead and run this Rails server command, because we're using React Query, it will eventually send a request out to the server trying to get the data that it said it would try and get. It does all of that without hitting the backend too many times. So how do we get this all set up? Well, thankfully, the overall process is pretty quick. Now, I do have a video that I will link to in the video description. This is the video right here. It is by Titus Ventures. This was by far the best tutorial I've watched in weeks. It is a 4-minute tutorial that teaches you how to create a React Chrome extension with Manifest v3. That's the gross ad blocker update one, in under 4 minutes, or I guess around 4 minutes. It's 4 minutes and 7 seconds. So definitely go watch this. I'll have a link to it in the video description. Maybe go subscribe to them, make their day. For now, what we're going to do is we're going to create this app. I'm going to CD out of here and I'm going to full screen this. I'm going to make sure I don't have a video already. It looks like I do. So I'm going to have to rm-rf the video folder. We'll then do a make dir for video, CD into video. Now that our housekeeping's done, we need to make our backend and our front end. Let's start by making our backend. We'll say Rails new backend. We'll call this, or we'll give it a -- API flag. That'll generate this as an API. Now we can very quickly just configure the entire backend because this part's pretty simple. I'm going to CD out of here, do a code dot in the overall directory so I have both the backend and the front end open as we go through this. Sorry about that, I was in the wrong folder. Okay, so now that we have this done, we can check out our backend folder here. In here, we have to come into our gem file. We have to scroll down to line 37 and uncomment the rack-cores gem. That'll give us the ability to have our cores policy set up, which means we do have to run we have to CD into our backend. We have to run a bundle install in our backend. Next, we can come into our initializers and our cores.rb, and we can uncomment all of this. Now, you want to make sure your delete is set up here. If it's not, you'll want to add delete as an option if you plan on deleting stuff, and we'll set the origins to be the asterisk. This will just be an API that's open up to the universe because security is not the point of this video. Next, we want to create those to-dos. We'll do a Rails G scaffold. I'll hit F11 to full screen this, and we can do a to-do model. We'll give it a name, and we'll give it a completed of type Boolean. So it'll look just like this. We can then go ahead and run this, and that will have our backend pretty much set up. At this point, what we can do is actually just run, if we're in the backend right here, we'll say Rails S to start this server. Now we'll come over to the front end tab that I have over here, and I'll CD out of our front end, and I'll CD out of our demo. We'll CD into our video. So this is where you would be inside of your video folder, just like we are over here. But instead of just having a backend, now we want to do a front end. For this, we'll be using Vite. So we'll say npm create Vite at latest. This will ask us for a name. I'm going to call this the front end. Then we're going to choose the React. You could also use Vue or Svelte or whatever. And I'm going to use JavaScript for this. Now we can CD into our front end, run a npm I. That will install our dependencies. And then once that's done, we can run a npm run dev, just like that. And that will start our server. We can come over to localhost 5173, click the counter a bunch and see that's working. Now you'll notice that hasn't set our API to work yet. In fact, right now the API isn't doing anything. Now why is that? Well, it's because our backend doesn't have any information. So we do have to run our migrations here. You'll see that has our to-dos appearing. Now what we have to do is just give it a to-do or two so we can actually, test this. Let's do a Rails C. In here, what we'll do is we'll say to-do.create. We'll give it a name of first to-do with a completed of false. And the plan here is to hopefully change this to be true in 10 minutes, maybe. Another one, and we'll say this one is going to be true just so we can test both cases. Exit out of here, run a Rails S, hit F11, and we'll see the Chrome extension is still working, which is pretty cool. But we want to use our custom Chrome extension that we're building here. So how's that work? We have to open up our front end. And in this tutorial, they cover essentially you only need to create a manifest.json file, and then your React project will work as expected. So what we're going to do is we're going to come into our public folder, right-click, new file, call this manifest.json. Because a lot of this stuff is just boring stuff to type out, I'm going to paste this in and we'll just talk about it. So basically, your manifest version is version 3 as of the time of this recording. Google's updating it so they can be mean about ads on the internet. We then give it a name, which is just whatever you want to call it, a description, which is just whatever you want to say it is, a version, which you can just pretty much make up, a action, which will be a default pop-up, which will be for our source index.html page, which is right here. And then we have the default title, which is going to be the React Rails. We then want to give it some permissions. We tell it inside of this array, we want to have scripting enabled, and we want to just pass in HTTP localhost port 3000/*. Don't know if this is necessary, but this is just what I have. Full disclosure, I use GitHub Copilot to generate this, and it seemed to work for me. So now that we have that, let's go ahead and let's add it to our browser so that we can have this cool little counter extension. We're going to go ahead and we're going to stop the Vite server, and then we're going to run a npm run build command. And I'm going to just test this in Chrome. I haven't tested this in Chrome yet. I've only been using Brave. So what we're going to do is we're going to come over to the Chrome browser, which I don't really use a lot anymore. And what we'll do is we'll go into the extensions and then the manage extensions. In here, we have to toggle developer mode. We can then load a unpacked extension, but we need to get access to this. Now, if you're on a normal computer where you don't need to jump through hoops, you just go find that directory. Me, I'm using WSL with Linux, so I have to find that directory. Easiest way for me to do that is to just type explorer.exe space and then a dot. It'll open up this folder inside of a Windows Explorer instance. I can then come over here and copy this and paste it into our select open thingy. In here, we want to select the dist folder. We'll click select. It now says this is loaded. There are some errors. And one of the errors here is that the permission is unknown or the URL pattern is malformed. We'll just go ahead and clear that. Nobody cares. Now, if we come over to a new tab, hopefully we can come into the React Rails, which I'll pin. We'll click on it, and you can see we have the count right here. So that's working. We have our Chrome extension. We probably don't need to have the URL set up like this, but it's fine. It's working. I'll leave that to someone smarter than myself with these things. The next thing we want to do is actually get this to be a useful Chrome extension and not just something that functions as a basic counter. So to do that, we're going to go ahead and run a npm run dev to start our server again. And we'll just go ahead and start developing this React app, because at this point, it's pretty much all it is. We're going to come into our source, our app.jsx, and we're going to go ahead and clear this out. Now, we won't see these changes in real time inside of our Chrome extension. Instead, we'll have to check in this web browser. So what we're going to do inside of our app.jsx is we're going to full screen the other window. And instead of having the React logo here, after the app.css, we're going to have to import a couple things. The first one will be a import for a to-dos component, which will import from something like ./features/to-dos/capital to-dos. So that means that inside of our source, we have to right-click new folder, call this the features folder. Then we'll create a to-dos feature. And then inside of to-dos, we can right-click new file and call this to-dos.jsx. I'll type RFCE and hit tab to generate this. If you don't have that, you can come over to your extensions and you're going to want to look for the React I think it's this one, the ES7 React Redux React Native Snippets. And then you'll just be able to type those shortcuts and it'll work just fine. So now that we have this, we can come back into our app.jsx, and in here what we want to do is not have this count, but we do want to create a const, which will be our API URL. And in this case, our API will be http://localhost port 3000, just like that. Next, we have our class name of app. In here, what I'd like to do is pass in the to-dos. That will give us our to-dos component that is now rendering on the screen. Perfect. The other thing I want to do is add in React query just so we can get started with that. So for that, we're going to have to stop the server, run an npm I react-query, and then we can go ahead and run a npm run dev again to start our server. Refresh, and it's like nothing happened. Inside of this file right here, what we now want to do is get rid of this use state. Down here below the inside of the return, we want to create a query client provider with a client that we pass in equal to query client. We can then go ahead and close this, hit enter, and then we'll tab over the to-dos inside of it. And in here, what we want to do is pass in the API URL, which we can do like this. And we'll just say API URL. Now for this query client, we do actually need to use this somehow. So where are we getting this query client from? Well, up here, we can just real quick say we have a const query client, which is equal to a new query client. And to actually use this, we do need to import both this query client and this provider. And we can do that with a import, open up some braces. We import the query client provider from react-query. Okay, so that initially won't change anything. The server will still work, but that gives us some powerful tools inside of our to-dos. Inside of these to-dos, what we want to do is start with a import for useQuery and useQuery client. We also want to import from a to-do component. This will be our individual to-dos. Inside of our features and our to-dos, right-click, new file, call this to-do.jsx. And inside of that to-do.jsx, we'll type rfce, hit tab, and then save this again. Over here in the to-dos, we can now get started on using these things that we're building out with the query, React query, I guess. We'll use the API URL. We'll come down here, we'll use a const for the query client, which we can use now, and then we'll create a const for our to-dos and our set to-dos. So now we're using React state. This should seem pretty familiar, but we're not going to use React dot. Instead, we'll use the use state and import that from React. The next thing we want to do in here is grab the to-dos from our API. To do this, we want to use a const, and then in here we need is loading, is error, data, and error. And then you can see here GitHub Copilot already knows what to do next. We say equals use query, and then we need to name this, give it a unique key. In my case, I'll just call it to-dos. And then we need to call a function. I'll call this fetch to-do list, just like that. Now we'll save this, we'll hit enter a couple times, and down here, if we are loading, which is going to happen if the server's down, we just say if is loading, then return a span of loading. If it's an error, we do the same thing, and you get the idea. Any of these things you can just throw in. If you're extracting it, you just set if it's one or the other, then return that. But for the actual fetch to-dos, which is the key component here, we say function fetch to-do list. We can close the brace. And then in here, what we need to do is return a fetch where we use the API URL. So this is localhost port 3000 /to-dos. We can hit enter. We then do a .then with a res and a res.json. And then we do a .then for the data. And then we do a set to-dos. And if you're so inclined, you can even return that data. And now that that's done, we can close this off. That gives us our fetch to-dos. Now we can come down here to our render function, or return, I guess. And we can say here's an h1. After the h1, here is a just regular old div. And inside of this div, let's use our to-dos that we set right here. And we want to do a to-dos.map with a to-do And then for each of these, we want to create a to-do component. The key will be the to-do.id. The to-do will be the to-do itself. We need the API URL. Maybe, I don't recall if I actually use this, but we'll set this equal to API underscore URL. And the last thing we need is a update to-do callback function, which we'll just call update to-do callback. Just like that. So the formatter is not going to be happy here. We do have to come down here and make sure that we tab all of this over. And now if we save this, it'll go ahead and format that. Now, in terms of the update to do callback function, we can come up here and we can just paste this in. It's just a regular old function, takes in one argument, which will be our updated to do. For that updated to do, we then need to use the query client. We're going to call a function on the query client, which is going to be a set query data. We pass in the key of to-dos, and then inside of here, what we want to do is not return the to-dos. That's actually wrong, GitHub Copilot. We want to set the to-dos. We use the old to-dos, and then we want to, inside of here, return the old .map for the to-do, and then we just check if the to-do ID is equal to the updated to-do ID, in which case we set it to be that updated to-do ID. If it's not, we return the to-do itself. We can then come down here and hopefully hit tab a couple times to clean up these braces, just like that. Hit save, and this is your completed function. So we go through here, find the to-do that needs to be updated, return it. If it's not that one, we return the unaltered other to-do, and we do that for the old to-dos to set the new to-dos, which is a very confusing sentence, but this effectively is the end of our to-dos JSX. Now, the last step here is going to be using the actual to-do itself. So in our to-do.jsx, we have to full screen this. And in here, we want to, once again, import a, it's going to be the use mutation from our React-query. This is the only thing we're going to do in here. And we need to pass in some braces, which will be our to-do, our API URL, and our update to-do callback, just like that. So what we do in here is we have to create this const mutation, right? And inside of this mutation, we're going to use the to-do. And then this is where the magic happens. We're going to start with a fetch request. We return a fetch. We pass in the API URL /todos and then /the to-do.id. By using the to-do.id as the parameter here, we don't run into the issue of an unpermitted parameter for the ID itself. So what we can do now is pass in a method of put. We then need to do our headers so that Rails knows this is a application /JSON. And then after that, what we want to do is come down here, do a body.stringify. But what we want to actually do here is hit enter. We want to use the to-do, and just to make sure that we're sanitizing this, we're going to set these to be undefined. Again, probably a cleaner way of doing this, but now that we have that, we can do a comma. We can come down here, and come down here, and come down here, and now we can define our onSuccess. Inside of our onSuccess, we can call a update to do callback. We can then close this, and then if you so desire, what you can do is save this so that everything gets formatted. But after the onSuccess, you can also create a onError, which will just be the error itself. We'll just do it like this. And then down here, we can do a console.log with an error set to error, just like that. And we can close this. For our success, we'll do something similar where we'll just console log our success. And that is effectively it. Now we can handle the actual to-do component. So let's come down here to the to-do and finish up. Inside this div, we'll create a span, which has our to-do.name inside of it. After that, we want to create our input of type checkbox. For our checked variable, we just want to use the to-do.completed. We then want to create a onChange function. So we want to use an onChange listener. So when this changes, we want to call the mutation.mutate. Again, we define mutation up here. The mutation.mutate is going to take in the to-do. and it's going to take in the completed and set it to be the not completed, basically, just effectively inverting it. We can then go ahead and hit enter, tab all of this down, hit Control S, come over here, and if we look at our app, we now have this. And if we come over to our backend, we can check. If I click this, it does do the update request right here. If we refresh, it's still updated. If we come over to the front end, we can uncheck these, refresh. We can also hit Control-Shift-I just to make sure that when this happens, we only print out our response. Cool. Final step, let's go ahead and package this up as a application for our manage extension stuff. So to do that, we'll stop the front end. We'll run a npm run build. Go ahead and run that. That runs it. We can now go ahead and click the little refresh button. We've reloaded it. If we open this up, we have our to-dos stuff back up and running. And we now have a Chrome extension that has a Rails backend with a React front end inside of it that is actually affecting the backend when we update it. So you'd ideally host your backend on a server somewhere, and then any computer that installs the extension could then use it. You'd authenticate through it or something, and you'd have all of that functionality you expect from a browser extension. One of my New Year's resolutions this year was to learn how to create a Chrome extension. Unfortunately, I put it off for 12 months, but before the end of the year, I managed to sit down for 93 minutes today and learn how to do all of this. So if you ever need to question how I get these videos done in 21 minutes, I don't. I spend 90 something minutes beforehand, and then I try to record them 4 or 5 times before it actually works. But yeah. Hopefully this was helpful and interesting. Hopefully you learned something, and hopefully I will see you in the next video.